It was the last Thursday of September 1967 when 22-year-old Mae Holloway stood at the back of the Piedmont County livestock barn and watched a man try to sell something the room had already decided was worthless. The auctioneer, a thick-necked man named Curtis Webb, held his clipboard with the particular resignation of someone reading an obituary. 100 spent production hens, factory origin, end of cycle. He said it the way you'd announce bad weather, flatly, without apology, because the facts were the facts, and Curtis Webb had been in this business long enough to know that dressing up ugly facts only made the eventual disappointment worse. The pen was in the far corner of the barn, away from the good lots, away from the healthy feeder calves with their bright eyes and the promising young sheep that had drawn competitive bidding from 3 counties, away from the John Deere planter that 2 men had nearly come to blows over. The spent hens had been placed where things go when the people running the auction are not entirely sure they should be there at all. In the corner, against the wall, out of the natural flow of a room that moved on the currency of potential. Mae had been at that auction for a different reason entirely. She had come for a used hay rake, a practical and sensible purchase for the 11 acres her grandmother had left her 8 months prior. She had the money counted out in an envelope in her coat pocket, exact and deliberate, the way her grandmother had always insisted money should be handled. "You count it before you leave the house," her grandmother used to say, "so you are never surprised by what you have when you get there." She found the hay rake, she evaluated it, she decided it was sound, and then, on her way back through the barn toward the registration desk, she passed the corner pen. She stopped. Not because she had a plan, not because she understood what she was looking at in any technical sense. She stopped because of the silence. 100 birds in a pen that size should have produced a sound. Not a loud sound, not the kind of noise that draws attention to itself, but the low, continuous conversation that a healthy flock generates without thinking about it, the way a healthy person breathes without thinking about breathing. It is a sound built from small movements and small opinions and the ongoing negotiation of birds that have something to say about their situation. These birds had nothing to say. They stood pressed together in the wire enclosure with the stillness of animals that had stopped expecting anything to be different. Their feathers, where they had feathers at all, were dull and flat, carrying none of the subtle iridescence that a well-kept bird carries even in poor light. The bare patches on their backs and shoulders were not the result of any single injury, but of a long, slow accumulation of conditions that had simply taken and taken without giving anything back. Their combs, which on a healthy laying hen should have been the deep red of good circulation and active production, were pale. Not pink, not even the faded pink of a bird under temporary stress. They were the color of something that had been left out too long, the color of a thing running on the last of whatever it had been given. Mae stood at the wire and looked at them for a long time. Curtis Webb called for opening bids. The room did not respond. He dropped the number, called again. Someone near the equipment door said something Mae couldn't quite hear, and the laughter around him laughed, and she understood without needing to hear the exact words that the laughter was about her and about what she was looking at. Earl Stanton was leaning against the support post 12 feet to her left. Earl Stanton was not a man who leaned casually. Everything Earl Stanton did was a performance of authority, including his leaning, which communicated that he was so thoroughly in command of any situation he found himself in that he could afford to be relaxed about it. He owned the largest commercial egg operation in Piedmont County, 400,000 birds in climate-controlled houses on 200 acres east of town. He supplied eggs to grocery chains across 3 states, and recently begun a conversation with a purchasing manager in Charlotte that he expected to conclude favorably before Christmas. He looked at Mae, he looked at the pen, he looked back at Mae with the specific expression of a man watching someone make a mistake he has seen made before and has long since lost the energy to prevent. "Girl," he said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse, "those birds are finished. They've been run through a production cycle that took everything they had. You put feed into them from now until spring and you won't see a single egg. The factory didn't throw them away because they were feeling generous. They threw them away because there is nothing left." Mae looked at him. She looked at the pen. She raised her hand. Curtis Webb brought the gavel down so fast it was almost startled. $8, 100 hens. The room produced a sound that was not quite laughter and not quite pity, but existed in the uncomfortable space between the two. Earl Stanton pushed off the support post and walked away, shaking his head with the slow, deliberate movement of a man filing something under confirmed. Mae went to pay. $8 from the envelope that had been counted before she left the house. She loaded the birds herself into the wooden crates she had thought to bring, working methodically through the pen, lifting each bird with the careful two-handed grip her grandmother had shown her when she was 7 years old. She checked each one briefly as she worked, not looking for anything specific, just letting her hands tell her what her eyes might miss. What her hands told her was that the birds were light, significantly, consistently light. They should have had more weight on them. The absence of that weight was a record of everything the past 2 years had cost them. She drove the 19 miles home on the county road at 10 miles under the limit because the cargo had lives in it, and the cargo had not chosen to be cargo, and the least she could do was take the corners carefully. From the truck bed came a sound, low and unsettled, the sound of birds in transition, unsure of what was happening, but registering, somewhere in the ancient biological machinery that governed their responses to the world, that something had changed. At least they were making some sound. Mae had been half afraid they wouldn't. Now, let me tell you something about what Mae Holloway was driving home to, because the land matters as much as the woman in a story like this one, and most people who tell stories like this one forget to tell you about the land. Her grandmother, Ida Holloway, had worked 11 acres outside the town of Crestwood for 31 years. Not a large operation by any measure, but a complete one. Ida had kept a kitchen garden that fed the family through every season. She had kept a small orchard of apple and pear trees that she had planted herself in 1941, and that by the time Mae was born were producing fruit of a quality that people drove considerable distances to purchase. She had goats and a milk cow, and always, always, a small flock of laying hens. Never more than 30, never fewer than 12. Just enough to keep the farm in eggs, and the eggs in trade with neighbors who needed them. Ida Holloway understood something about land that the agricultural colleges of her era were not yet teaching, and that the commercial farming operations of the 1960s had actively chosen to forget. She understood that a farm was not a factory. A factory takes raw materials and converts them into product through the application of controlled inputs. A factory can be optimized. A factory can be scaled. A factory can be run on the logic of maximum output at minimum cost, and that logic will hold as long as the inputs remain available and affordable, and the outputs remain in demand. A farm is something else entirely. A farm is a living system. It breathes, it cycles, it takes and gives back in a rhythm that, if respected, compounds over time into something the accountants have no column for. The soil feeds the plant feeds the animal feeds the soil. Each generation of that cycle, if allowed to complete itself, leaves the system slightly richer than it found it, slightly more capable, slightly more alive. Ida had known this not because she had read it in a book, though she had read many books, but because she had watched it happen beneath her own hands for 30 decades. She had watched the soil in her kitchen garden darken and deepen over the years, as the compost she turned into it every autumn accumulated into something that smelled like rain and earthworms and quiet time. She had watched her apple trees grow more productive, not less, as they aged, because their roots had found their way into soil that had been steadily enriched by 30 years of falling leaves and hen manure and the slow decomposition of everything the farm produced that did not get eaten. She had tried to give Mae this understanding the way you try to give someone a language, not in a single lesson, in 1,000 small moments over the 18 years Mae had spent on that land before leaving for teacher's college. One afternoon, when Mae was 11, she had found her grandmother crouched in the hen yard watching the flock with the focused attention most people reserve for things they were being paid to observe. Mae crouched beside her and watched too, though she wasn't sure what she was watching for. After a long while, her grandmother said, without looking up, "What do you see?" Mae looked at the hens. They were doing what hens did, moving through the yard, scratching, pecking, conducting the small, purposeful business of birds that had somewhere to be and something to find when they got there. "Chickens," Mae said. Her grandmother made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Look at the ground," she said. "Look at what they're doing to it." Mae looked at the ground. The hens were scratching it up, turning it over, working through it with the methodical intensity of small machines designed specifically for this purpose. And where they had been, the ground was different, looser, darker, turned over and aerated with the small deposits that a healthy hen leaves behind her wherever she goes. "They're not just finding food," her grandmother said. "They're making it, for the ground, for the worms, for next year's garden. They don't know that's what they're doing. They're just being what they are. But what they are, when you let them be it fully, is one of the most useful things on a farm. She paused and picked up a handful of the turned earth and held it to her nose the way her grandmother had done 100 times. "The mistake people make," she said, setting the earth back down carefully, "is thinking a hen is a machine for making eggs. She's not. She's a creature with a nature. You work with the nature, and the eggs come as a consequence. You work against the nature, and you get eggs for a while, and then you get nothing. And then you get what that man was selling today for whatever he could get." Mae had not known what man her grandmother was referring to. She had not asked. She had simply filed the words in the place where important things went and gone back to watching the hens work the ground. She had not thought about those words in years. She had thought about them every day for the past 3 weeks. She pulled into the farm at dusk, the light going gold and thin across the 11 acres, and began unloading the crates. The first thing she did, before she opened a single crate, was walk the property and decide where the birds would live. Not where was convenient, where was right. Her grandmother had kept the hen yard on the south side of the barn, where it got morning sun and afternoon shade from the old cedar line along the eastern edge of the property. Mae had assumed as a child that this was simply where the hen yard had always been. She understood now that it was where the hen yard was because her grandmother had thought carefully about where it should be. Morning sun meant the birds would be active and warm in the early hours when their biological rhythms pushed them toward laying. Afternoon shade meant they would not be stressed by heat during the hottest part of the day. And a hen under heat stress redirects the energy her body would otherwise put toward egg production into the simpler work of keeping herself cool. The cedar line broke the winter wind from the north. The ground on the south side of the barn had 30 years of accumulated organic matter worked into it by generations of Mae Holloway's hens. It was, Mae realized, as she crouched and pressed her palm flat to it the way her grandmother had taught her, already alive in a way the rest of the property was not. She built the temporary fence that evening by lantern light. Cedar posts driven into ground that received them easily, the way good ground receives things. Wires stretched taut and stapled, a gate hinged on a bent post that she could open with one hand. She built the water stations the following morning, 3 large troughs positioned at intervals through the yard, gravity-fed from the hill tank her grandfather had installed in 1952 and that still worked because he built it to last, and her grandmother had maintained it because maintaining things that worked was not a burden but a practice. She put down fresh straw in the old hen house, not a thin layer, a real layer, 4 inches of it, the kind that invited the birds to do what chickens do in straw, which was scratch it up and make their own arrangements and find the small things that lived in it, and generally conduct the business of being chickens in a way that a bare concrete floor did not permit and had never been designed to permit. She mixed the feed carefully, not straight layer pellets, which was what the factory birds had almost certainly been eating, a diet engineered for maximum production at minimum cost, a diet that gave the birds exactly what they needed to produce eggs and nothing more, no variety, no supplement, no acknowledgement that a living creature might have nutritional needs that exceeded the minimum required for the output being extracted from her. Mae added oyster shell in a separate trough because calcium was the essential mineral for shell formation and shell quality, and a hen whose diet was deficient in calcium would produce thin-shelled eggs that broke easily and eventually stop producing eggs at all, as her body, finding no calcium in her diet, began drawing it from her own bones to meet the biological demand. She added kitchen scraps, apple cores from the tree her grandmother had planted, vegetable trimmings, old bread torn into pieces, the kind of varied supplemental diet that costs almost nothing and means everything to a bird whose digestive system evolved over millions of years to process a wide range of organic material, and whose capacity for health and productivity expands in direct proportion to the variety and quality of what she is given. She opened the first crate at the gate to the yard and stepped back. The birds did not come out. She had expected this. The pamphlet on factory layer operations had been precise about it. Birds from confinement systems had no experience of open space. An open door was not, to them, an anomaly, a disruption in the pattern of the world that had never included open doors. Their entire understanding of what the world was formed in conditions that did not include grass, or open sky,
or the freedom to move more than a few inches in any direction. To step through an open door into a yard was not a simple physical act. It was an act of imagination. It required them to conceive of a world larger than the one they had ever been shown. One bird worked her way to the opening. She was among the worst looking of the lot, which, given the general condition of the 100, was saying something significant. Her back was bare from the base of her neck to her tail, not patchy, but completely unfeathered, the skin visible and slightly pink, and carrying the faint, vulnerable look of something that had been exposed for too long. Her comb was so pale it was nearly white. She was light in the way that said her body had been spending its reserves for longer than anybody should be asked to spend them. She put her head out of the crate. She pulled it back. She put it out again. She looked at the ground with the careful, calculating expression of a creature encountering something for which she has no prior category. Mae stood 12 feet away and did not move. The bird put one foot on the grass. She had almost certainly never felt grass. The pamphlet had confirmed what Mae had suspected, that the birds in this factory had spent their entire productive lives on wire flooring, their feet never once touching actual ground, their entire physical experience of the world mediated through a surface designed for drainage and cleaning efficiency, rather than the comfort or the natural behavior of the animal standing on it. The sensation of grass, of real earth, of ground that gave slightly under the pressure of a foot and smelled of living things, was entirely outside anything this bird had ever experienced. She stood with one foot on the grass and one foot still inside the crate for what Mae counted as nearly a full minute. Then she put the second foot down. Mae thought in that moment of something her grandmother had said once that she had not understood at the time and was only now beginning to understand. She had said it while watching one of her own hens stand at the edge of a new section of yard that Ida had opened up for the first time. She had said, very quietly and not really to Mae, "Everything alive is braver than it looks." The bird took 3 steps into the yard. Mae opened the next crate. The first week, the eggs were 0.
She had prepared herself for this. The pamphlet had been clear. Birds under the stress of relocation and recovery typically ceased production for 1 to 3 weeks, while their bodies redirected resources away from the energetically expensive process of egg formation and toward the more immediate demands of adjustment, healing, and basic physiological stabilization. Egg production is not, from the body's perspective, a simple or cheap process. A single egg requires calcium for the shell, protein for the white, fat and vitamins and minerals for the yolk, and the coordinated activity of a hormonal system that is exquisitely sensitive to stress, nutrition, light, temperature, and the general assessment the bird's body is constantly making of whether conditions are safe and stable enough to justify the investment. A hen that has been through what these hens have been through was a hen whose body had made a reasonable and accurate decision to suspend that investment until further notice. Mae noted 0 in the composition book she had set up on the shelf inside the henhouse door. Black cover, her grandmother's name written on the inside front cover, crossed out, and Mae's name written beneath it. She had found it in the filing cabinet with the pamphlets, half filled with Ida's precise annotations, and had continued it from the first blank page as naturally as if she had always known she would. 0 on Monday, 0 on Tuesday, 0 through the rest of the week. She noted each one without distress. They were data. Data was not disappointment. Data was information, and information was what you used to understand what was actually happening, rather than what you feared or hoped was happening. The town predictably had a different relationship with the zeros. Word had moved through Crestwood the way word always moved through small towns, which was faster than the events themselves and with a confidence that bore no relationship to the amount of actual information involved. By the end of the first week, most of the people who gathered at the Crestwood Feed and Hardware on Saturday mornings knew that Mae Holloway had paid $8 for 100 worn-out factory hens that nobody else would touch, and that the hens had not produced a single egg, and that the feed costs were going to eat her alive before Christmas, and that the whole thing would be over by spring. Earl Stanton heard this report with the satisfaction of a man whose prediction is being confirmed on schedule. He was at the feed store himself that Saturday, buying nothing he particularly needed, conducting instead the kind of social maintenance that kept a man of his position connected to the texture of local opinion.
He said, with the measured generosity of someone who has decided not to enjoy another person's misfortune too openly, that he hoped the girl had not spent money she couldn't afford. He said it was a shame, really, that no one had explained to her the basic economics of spent layer hens before she had gotten herself into the situation. He said these things without smiling, which was the most effective way to say them. Mae was at the farm when these things were being said about her. She was doing what she did every morning and every evening, which was walking the yard, counting the birds, checking the water levels, checking the feed, observing without agenda, the way her grandmother had crouched in the hen yard and watched and waited for the ground to tell her what it needed. In the 3rd week, she saw it. She was doing her morning walk, the light still low and golden across the yard, and she crouched next to the bird she had been watching most carefully, the one who had been first out of the crate, the worst-looking one, the one she had privately named First because she had not planned to name any of them, and had named this one anyway without quite deciding to. She looked at First's shoulder. There were new feather shafts coming in, thin as bristles, barely visible against the pale skin, but present, undeniably, quietly, stubbornly present. Mae sat back on her heels in the damp morning grass and felt something she did not try to name move through her chest. She went to the composition book and wrote, Week 3, Day 2, new feather growth observed on shoulders and upper back, most visible on First. Comb color improving in approximately 15 to 20% of the flock. The comb color was the thing she watched most carefully because it was the most reliable external indicator of what was happening inside. A pale comb meant a bird whose circulatory system was not delivering adequate resources to the periphery, a bird whose body was operating in a kind of managed retreat, doing the minimum necessary to sustain life while suspending everything that was not immediately essential. A red comb meant a bird whose body had assessed the situation and decided that conditions were stable enough to begin reinvesting in its full range of biological functions, including the hormonal cascade that resulted in egg production. The combs were changing, slowly. Not all of them, not dramatically, but the direction was clear and consistent, and Mae noted it every morning with the precision of someone who understood that a trend is only visible if you are paying close enough attention to see it before it becomes obvious. On the morning of the 31st day, Mae walked into the hen house at 6 o'clock and held her lantern up and stood in the doorway for a moment before walking to the nearest nest box. 3 eggs. She looked in the next one. 2 eggs. She went down the row. By the time she reached the end, she had 31 eggs in her grandmother's flat basket, the wide, shallow one woven from white oak splits that Ida had used for 30 years and that still held its shape because white oak, properly harvested and properly woven, does not surrender easily to time. 31 eggs from a hen house that had been producing between 1 and 3 a day for the past month. Mae stood in the middle of the hen house with the basket and looked at what she had. She did not express this to anyone. She went to the composition book and wrote, Week 5, Day 1, collected eggs, 31. She underlined the number once. It was the only acknowledgement she made of what it meant. The next morning, 38. The morning after, 42. By the end of the week, the daily count was consistently above 50. But it was not the number that stopped her. It was the color. She cracked an egg into the white bowl she had begun keeping on the shelf for this purpose, the way her grandmother had kept a white bowl on the kitchen windowsill for the same reason, because a white bowl showed you what was actually in an egg without the distraction of a colored surface. She looked at the yolk. It was not yellow. It was not the pale, uniform yellow of the eggs she had grown up buying at the Crestwood General Store, the eggs that came in cardboard cartons with the name of a company printed on the side, eggs that were consistent and reliable and entirely without character. It was not even the deeper yellow of a good backyard egg from a well-kept hen. It was orange, a deep, saturated, almost aggressive orange that sat in the white of the egg like a small sun, like something that had been concentrating color for weeks and finally been given the space to express it. Mae looked at it for a long time. What she was seeing was the result of a biological process that the commercial egg industry had not so much eliminated as suppressed. A hen's yolk carries the color of her diet, the way a river carries the color of the land it moves through. A factory hand on a diet of formulated corn and soy meal, a diet engineered for nutritional adequacy and cost efficiency and the ability to be produced and delivered at industrial scale, produces a yolk that is pale because her diet is pale, because it is narrow, because it contains the minimum of the fat-soluble pigments called carotenoids that a hen's body deposits in the yolk as it forms. These carotenoids, found abundantly in green plants, in insects, in the varied organic material that a hen foraging on real ground encounters in the course of a normal day, are what give a truly free-range egg yolk its color. They are also, not coincidentally, what give it much of its nutritional density. A pale yolk is a quiet yolk. It is the yolk of a hen who has been given the minimum. A deep orange yolk is a yolk that has been earned by a hen living the full range of what a hen's life is supposed to be, eating what a hen's body evolved over thousands of years to eat, moving through ground that offers the variety and the living complexity that a concrete floor or a wire cage cannot. Mae's hens had been given real ground, real grass, real insects, kitchen scraps, oyster shell, morning sun, the cedar line breaking the north wind, 30 years of her grandmother's accumulated organic matter beneath their feet. They had been given, for the first time in their productive lives, the conditions that their biology had always been designed for. And their biology had responded the only way biology knows how to respond to the right conditions, which was to express itself fully.
She cracked a second egg, same color. She cracked a third, the same. She stood at the shelf and looked at the 3 yolks sitting in the white bowl like 3 small concentrated suns, and understood, without yet knowing what to do with the understanding, that what she had was not simply eggs. What she had was something different, something the carton at the general store could not produce and had never been designed to produce. She did not tell anyone, not yet. She wrote in the composition book, and she kept doing the work, and she waited for the understanding to develop itself the way a photograph develops in a dark room, slowly and in the dark and in its own time. It was Earl Stanton who inadvertently set the next thing in motion, which was a piece of irony that Mae would appreciate more fully in the years that followed. Earl had concluded his conversation with the Charlotte purchasing manager in November, as he had expected to. The contract was for grocery chain distribution across 4 counties, a significant expansion of his operations' reach, the kind of contract that justified the investment he had made in his climate-controlled houses and his automated feeding systems and his relationship with the grain suppliers who kept his input costs manageable. He celebrated quietly, the way men of Earl's disposition celebrated, which was by telling the right people in a tone that communicated he had expected nothing less. What Earl did not know, and would not know until it was too late to adjust his position, was that in the same city of Charlotte, in a neighborhood that Earl had no particular reason to be aware of, a restaurant had opened 6 months prior that was doing something the Charlotte dining scene had not seen before. The restaurant was called Hearth. It was run by a chef named Daniel Foss, who had spent 4 years in France learning things about ingredients that most American chefs of his era had not yet been taught, and who had returned to North Carolina with a set of convictions about food that his contemporaries considered impractical and his customers were beginning to consider revelatory. Daniel Foss believed, with the quiet ferocity of a man who has seen the difference with his own eyes and cannot unsee it, that the quality of an ingredient was not a detail but a foundation. That a dish built on a mediocre egg was a dish built on sand, regardless of the skill applied to it afterward. He had been buying his eggs from 3 different local suppliers since Hearth opened, and had been dissatisfied with all of them in ways he could describe precisely and at length to anyone who asked, which was not many people because most people had not yet developed the vocabulary for the kind of dissatisfaction he was describing. He had a customer named Ruth Alderman, who drove down from Piedmont County once a month for dinner, and who had been eating at Hearth since it opened because she was one of the people who had developed the vocabulary. Ruth Alderman was also, by a coincidence that is less of a coincidence when you consider how small the world is in a particular county, the woman who bought eggs from Mae Holloway's farm gate stand every Friday morning. She had started buying them because the sign at the end of Mae's driveway was hand-lettered and honest, and Ruth Alderman had a weakness for hand-lettered, honest signs. She had kept buying them because of what happened when she cracked them into a pan. She brought 2 dozen to Daniel Foss on a Tuesday evening in February, carried them into the restaurant kitchen in a cloth bag, and set them on his prep table without ceremony, and said simply, "Try these." He cracked one into a white bowl. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. He cracked a second one. He looked at that one too. He picked up the bowl and held it under the prep light and tilted it slowly and watched the yolk move.
"Where," he said, "did these come from?" Ruth told him about the farm gate stand and the hand-lettered sign, and the woman named Mae Holloway who had bought 100 spent hens for $8 at the Piedmont County livestock auction that previous September, and had, by some combination of knowledge and patience and the right 11 acres of North Carolina ground, produced an egg that Daniel Foss was now holding up to the light with the expression of a man who has just been handed the answer to a question he has been asking for 6 months. He drove to Crestwood the following Thursday. Mae was in the yard, doing her morning round, when the car she did not recognize turned off the county road and came up her drive. She watched it come without moving from where she was standing, which was beside the cedar line, checking the condition of the ground at the edge of the yard, a thing she did every week because the ground at the edge told you things about the whole that the ground in the middle kept to itself. The man who got out was not what she had expected, though she had not expected anyone. He was younger than she had pictured a Charlotte chef to be, which was an assumption she corrected immediately since she had no particular basis for it. He wore clothes that were practical without being farm clothes, the clothes of a man who spent most of his time indoors but was not uncomfortable outdoors. He looked at the yard, he looked at the birds, he looked at the ground. "You're Mae Holloway?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Ruth Alderman told me about your eggs." "I know Ruth. She's reliable." He smiled at that. "Can I see the operation?" She walked him through it, not performing it, just showing it. The yard, the cedar line, the water stations, the hen house with its 4 inches of straw, and the composition book on the shelf. She showed him the composition book without being asked because the composition book was the operation as much as the yard was, and she had learned from her grandmother that if you were going to show someone something, you should show them the whole thing. He read several pages without speaking. He looked at the charts. He looked at the daily egg counts and the condition notes she had written in the margins, the same way Ida had written in the margins of the pamphlets themselves. He looked up from the book. "Can I crack an egg?" he said. She took him to the hen house and got a white bowl from the shelf and handed him an egg from the morning's collection. He cracked it. He looked at it. He looked at Mae. "I'll buy everything you can produce at 3 times whatever you're currently charging." Mae looked at him steadily. "Why 3 times?" she asked. Not suspiciously, genuinely. She wanted to understand the logic. "Because," he said, "I have been looking for this egg for 2 years, and I did not know until this morning that I was going to find it 19 miles from my city in Charlotte, in a neighborhood that Earl had no particular reason to be aware of. Also because my customers will pay for it, and I intend to charge them accordingly, and it seems reasonable that you should benefit from what you've built here at a rate that reflects what it actually is." Mae considered this. She looked at the bowl, she looked at the yard through the henhouse door, at the 100 birds moving through the morning light with a purposeful quality of animals that had found their footing in a place and intended to stay. "All right," she said. She did not celebrate. She went back to the composition book and wrote, "Thursday, February 8th, 1968. Chef Daniel Foss, Hearth Restaurant, Charlotte. Agreement agreed. Full production, weekly delivery." She noted the rate. She underlined it once. Then she went to check the water levels, because the water levels needed checking, and the fact that something significant had just happened did not change the fact that the water levels needed checking. Earl Stanton heard about it on a Saturday at the feed store, which is where Earl Stanton heard about most things. The version he heard had acquired some details in transit that were not precisely accurate, but that were accurate in spirit, which is the way important information usually travels in small towns. He heard that the Holloway girl's eggs were going to a restaurant in Charlotte. He heard the rate she was being paid. He stood at the counter of the feed store and heard these things and did not say anything for long enough that the man telling him noticed the silence and stopped talking. What Earl was experiencing, though he would not use this word for it, was the specific discomfort of a man whose model of the world has just been asked to accommodate a fact that doesn't fit inside it. His model of the world included a clear and settled understanding of what a spent factory hen was, and what it was capable of, and what happened to the people who paid money for things that had already been used up and discarded. His model of the world did not have a column for what Mae Holloway had done. And a model of the world without a column for a fact does not eliminate the fact. It just leaves the model incomplete, and the incompleteness sits in a man like a stone in a boot, present and irritating every step he takes until he does something about it. He drove to Crestwood on a Tuesday afternoon. Not on a Saturday, not on a day that the feed store would know he had gone. On a Tuesday, when the roads were quiet and the county was busy with its own business, and a man could drive somewhere without it becoming a story by supper. Mae was in the yard. She was always in the yard in the afternoon. She saw his car and she knew it, and she kept doing what she was doing, which was checking the condition of the birds near the east fence, until she had parked and gotten out and walked to the yard gate and stood there. "Mae," he said. "Earl," she said. She did not move toward the gate. She finished what she was doing, which was noting the condition of a bird she had been watching for 3 days, and then she walked to the gate and stood on her side of it. He looked at the yard for a long time, at the birds, at the ground, at the cedar line and the way the afternoon light came through it and lay across the yard in long, warm sections. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has made a decision about and is now revising that decision and is not entirely comfortable with the revision. "I was wrong," he said. He said it the way men of Earl's disposition said things they had decided to say, which was directly and without decoration, because decoration would have made it easier, and he had decided it should not be easy. Mae looked at him. "You said what you knew," she said, "based on what you knew." "I didn't know what I was doing, not entirely. I knew what my grandmother knew. That's different from knowing it yourself." Earl was quiet for a moment. "What did your grandmother know?" he said. Mae thought about a woman crouched in a hen yard watching the ground. She thought about a white bowl on a kitchen windowsill. She thought about a filing cabinet full of annotated pamphlets and a composition book with 2 names in the front, one crossed out and one not. She knew, Mae said, that a hen is not a machine. She knew that if you give a living thing what it actually needs, it will give you back more than you were counting on. She knew the difference between the minimum and the right amount. She knew it about hens. I think she knew it about most things.
Earl looked at the yard again, at the 100 birds that had been worth $8 in September and were now under contract to a Charlotte restaurant at a rate that was changing the arithmetic of everything Mae Holloway did. He nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man who has processed something and is filing it in a new column. He did not apologize with words. He had already apologized with the drive on a Tuesday. He turned and walked back to his car and drove back down the county road toward his 400,000 birds in their climate-controlled houses, and Mae watched him go and then turned back to the yard because the yard needed attending, and Earl Stanton's arrival and departure did not change that. The years that followed were not dramatic in the way that people who tell stories about them sometimes make them. They were the years of a farm finding its full expression. Mae expanded the flock gradually, never faster than the land and her attention could support, because she had understood from the beginning that the thing she was selling was not simply eggs, but a specific quality of egg that was the direct product of a specific quality of attention. And attention could not be scaled the way square footage could be scaled. You could build more hen houses. You could not manufacture more of the particular quality of observation that produced the results that Daniel Foss had driven 19 miles to find. She hired one person in her 3rd year, a young woman from the county who had grown up on a farm and who had the specific quality of patience that the work required. She trained her grandmother had trained her, not in a single lesson, but in 1,000 small moments. She showed her the composition book. She showed her how to walk the yard without disturbing what you were trying to observe. She showed her how to read a comb and how to check the ground and how to understand the difference between a hen that was declining and a hen that was adjusting. She added a 2nd yard in her 4th year, carved from the southern edge of the property where the soil was good and the light was right. She planted a hedgerow along its eastern boundary, not because a hedgerow was fashionable, but because her grandmother's pamphlets had described the way a hedgerow provided insects and shelter, and the kind of biological diversity that a hen's foraging instincts were designed to exploit. The hedgerow took 2 years to establish, and then became one of the most productive features of the farm, a living pantry that the birds worked through every day with the focused intensity of animals doing exactly what they had evolved to do. Daniel Foss told the story of Mae's eggs to every food writer who came through his restaurant, which over the years became a significant number, because Hearth became the kind of restaurant that food writers came to. The story was good. It had the elements that stories need to travel: a woman, a discarded thing, a decision that looked like foolishness and turned out to be wisdom. The eggs from the Holloway farm in Crestwood, North Carolina became the kind of ingredient that people mentioned by name, the way they mentioned particular vineyards or particular fisheries, as a provenance that meant something beyond the generic category. Earl Stanton's commercial operation continued. It was a sound operation, and he ran it soundly, and it continued to do what commercial egg operations do, which was produce a reliable volume of eggs at a price the grocery chains required.
He and Mae existed in the same county without conflict, because they were not really in the same business, which was something neither of them had understood on the day she raised her hand at Curtis Webb's auction, and he shook his head and walked away. They were both selling eggs, but Mae was selling something that could not be produced at scale, could not be replicated by automation, could not be engineered by a nutritionist into a formulated feed. She was selling the product of a particular philosophy applied to a particular piece of land over a particular span of time by a particular quality of attention. You could not build a factory to produce that. The factory was, by its nature, the thing that prevented it. Cora Holloway knew this. She had known it in the way that people who have spent 30 years watching things know things, not as an argument, but as an observation so thoroughly confirmed by experience that it has stopped being a belief and become simply a fact, like the direction the creek runs or the way the light falls on the south yard in September. Mae knew it now too, in her hands, in the composition book that was on its 4th volume, in the yard that her grandmother's hens had enriched, and that her own hens had enriched further, the soil darkening and deepening year by year in the patient compounding way of living systems that are being asked to do what they were designed to do. She was 41 years old when she sat her niece down in the hen house on a September morning and put the first composition book in her hands. Her niece was 14, the age at which important things can be received if they are offered correctly, which meant without pressure and without performance, just the plain offering of one hand to another across the space between one generation and the next. The book held the book and looked at the first page. Ida Holloway, crossed out. Mae Holloway. Below it, in the space Mae had left deliberately, the girl wrote her own name in the careful handwriting of someone who understood, even at 14, that she was writing in a place that mattered. Mae watched her do it. She did not say anything. The henhouse was full of the sound it was supposed to be full of, the low, continuous conversation of 100 birds conducting the ongoing business of being exactly what they were. Outside, the September light was doing what it always did in September, going gold and long and generous across the yard that 3 women had built out of attention and patience and the understanding that a living thing, given what it actually needs, will always give back more than you were counting on. The composition book passed from one pair of hands to another in the warm half-light of the henhouse. Outside, the flock moved through the yard. The ground received them. The cedar line held the north wind back. The eggs that would come tomorrow would be the color of something that had been earned. They always were.